that we are covering. Let me know if you can hear me okay, see me okay. And we're now on chapter 29, which is Our Nature is Simplicity Itself. So let me know if the sound and video are coming through okay. I think there may be a problem with the Facebook streaming today and LinkedIn, so it might not be coming through on those platforms. But at least on the other couple it should, so just shoot me a message. And by the way, for those of you asking, the book is available on Amazon. If you do have the book, please leave a rating on Amazon so other people can decide if it is helpful for them. Okay, looks like it is coming through. So as we wait for others, let's begin with a brief meditation here. So easy and full breaths, relaxing the body, relaxing everything. So today, since the topic is simplicity, we will keep even this meditation simple. Breathing fully and easily. Letting everything wash away like waves of the ocean washing over you. Simplicity. Allow the breath to follow you. The place from which all thought arises, all intuition arises, all feeling arises. And the place where they all return. All right. So it looks like the Facebook stream is not going through, but the other channels are going through, so we'll go with it. Now let's start with some questions from last week. One is, so in case you've joined since the meditation, this is the book we're covering. Is This a Dream? We're now on chapter 9, which is Our Nature is Simplicity Itself. The whole chapter is one page. All right. So from last week, questions are, first, we strive to integrate enlightenment experience with everyday experience. Is this a process? So remember last week and also in the book, we try to look at what is referred to by this word enlightenment and how it's looked at differently depending on the tradition, depending on the person, depending on the circumstance, the culture. There's no one definition for what this word is referring to. So that's important to keep in mind when we talk about integrating enlightenment experience with everyday experience. What exactly is this experience that we're integrating, right? And is this a process? So if we simply look at what enlightenment is referring to as deepening insight, right? It's a very simple way of saying it because no matter what definition or what way, what culture we come from in terms of how they think about it, all of them involve this deepening insight, right? So I often say a better word is enlightening, right? Enlightening experience, seeing into something more clearly, seeing into this experience right now more deeply, seeing into the things we read, the situations we're in, right? The difficult moments and the easier moments, seeing into all these more deeply, more subtly, more completely, this can be spoken about as enlightening. Now, there's certain thresholds or certain events that people refer to as this is enlightenment or that is, and I find that is not so much helpful. It's helpful to know how people are talking about it, but if it's just one fixed thing, then it's almost as if there's a before and after, and I don't think it's so stark. I don't think it's helpful to talk about it as so stark. So with that background, the answer to this question, this striving to integrate enlightening experience with everyday experiences, the process, this is an ongoing process. As long as we're talking about ourselves as individuals functioning in this world, and playing different roles as husbands and wives and parents and sisters and brothers and citizens and professionals, anything, there's an ongoing process of insight that's deepening, right? There might be different thresholds. However, there's still that deepening insight, right? What is that undifferentiated consciousness? It is as it is and it doesn't change. That is not something that's developing, right? So it depends on the perspective that we take. If we go back to how we talked about ocean, wave, and water, the the wave is always modifying itself. It's becoming subtle as it is merging with this ocean, right? So this ocean is, and we can say, an entire kind of oneness, and this wave is ever becoming subtler and subtler and subtler, and at some threshold it is recognizing that yes, this wave that I am is this ocean, right? Because that boundary is not so rigid anymore. It can still experience and recognize what the wave is, essentially how it is different, and it is also modifying itself in such a way that it can see through that, right? So from the wave's perspective, yes, there's this constant processing and processing and processing that's happening. From the ocean's perspective, the ocean says, well, I'm the ocean, that's it, right? Waves or no waves, this is the ocean. So it depends on the perspective that we take, but from the perspective of the boundary becoming more clear and thinner, yes, there is that ongoing process of integrating until such point that there is some kind of equilibrium reached, right? So in the body, for example, if you go outside on a very cold day, if you're hot inside, the heater is on inside, and then you go outside on a very cold day, eventually your body is going to lose that heat, right? In fact, if you're overheated, it might automatically start cooling. It might dilate the blood vessels and the blood starts going to the periphery, and we lose the heat through the periphery of our body into the environment, right? But at some point, it's going to become too cold so that those blood vessels may constrict again. So there's an equilibrium that's reached in temperature, right? That the body wants to maintain. We call that homeostasis, right? And as that homeostasis is reached, that's the ideal functional state for the body. So similarly, what we refer to as the second mind or approaching the second mind in this culture is likely to be considered an ideal functioning state in the sense that one is still aware of all the societal norms, of the societal understandings, societal ways of doing things, societal ways of speaking, on and on, right? This is how we interact, we communicate, and yet there's also that vision that's beyond strict distinction, right? There's that vision that is beyond distinction, that poets and artists and musicians try to express in some way, right? And even beyond that, that kind of silence, that inexpressible nature of the second mind. So here there's some kind of equilibrium because of this process. The question was, is there a process? Because of this process of seeing through this boundary without letting go of the boundary absolutely, there eventually reaches some kind of equilibrium, right? And this is what we're referring to as nearer to the second mind or as the second mind. And at this point, it's a different kind of process. It's simply maintaining the equilibrium, just as the body maintains homeostasis. It maintains temperature through various means, through shivering, through changes in the blood vessels. It maintains the pH, right? The pH of the body it maintains right around 7.4 or so. And it maintains that through the kidneys, through getting rid of waste, through the way we breathe. All of these mechanisms are involved in homeostasis, keeping that balance. So the process of maintaining that equilibrium might be different than of getting to that equilibrium from a significantly disequilibrated state, right? So the process of moving from the first mind to the second mind can vary in many ways. It can be bouncy, it can be sudden, it can have rough edges. There's an entire process to it, or it can be relatively smooth. Then having reached some kind of equilibrium, it's a different kind of process, right? A constant refining process. Manisha asks, is homeostasis possible all the time? Homeostasis is necessary for the body to survive. It is absolutely necessary. So it is not only possible, it is needed and necessary and happening. Now, we can certainly lose homeostasis, and if we lose homeostasis long enough, the body dies, right? So as long as the body is living, there is some level of homeostasis, and that is why it can live, right? The pH of the body is around 7.4. If it starts going to 7.3, 7.2, once you go below 7.2, it can reach life-threatening levels, right? And same thing in the other direction, right? The temperature of the body is around 98 degrees Fahrenheit. We know what it feels like to just go 3 degrees above to 101 can be extremely uncomfortable. And if you go to 104 or 105, beyond that, it starts to get life-threatening, right? And similarly for all the way down. You know, if your body temperature is going below 90, 88 degrees, you're not functioning like you usually function. So homeostasis is possible all the time. It's necessary all the time. It doesn't mean that it doesn't get violated. See, if this is the balance, at some point, we can say this is the homeostatic mechanism. But at some point, if the gap starts to widen too much and we're not able to close it, then this is where homeostasis fails, and this is where death starts to happen, where we talk about dysfunction and or death, right? So similarly in the second mind metaphor for this, as that homeostasis of having recognizing this second mind, that is a different kind of process than the first mind being totally different. This is where the first mind can feel like it's suffocating, like nothing makes sense, like everything is overwhelming all the time, right? So these experiences are kind of a disequilibration. It doesn't mean that homeostasis isn't being attempted. It is. In fact, that is why people look into questions like, what's going on? Who am I? How is this perception happening? What is it that all of these traditions are talking about? Why are people talking about all these? This expression of the first mind, these kinds of expressions are signs of this homeostatic mechanism functioning and trying to return to the state of balance, trying to return to this homeostasis. All right. Do we only know what we know relative to other things we know in the first mind? Yes, any particular kind of knowledge is known relative to something else in the first mind, right? And that's why it's easy to talk about, let's say, things in the world, right? So there's a laptop in front of me. It's easy to talk about a laptop. First of all, as soon as I say laptop, you know what I'm referring to, generally speaking, right? You know by the screen, you know by the keys. I can say, as I type on the keys, it makes a click-clack sound as I'm typing, and everybody knows what I mean, right? Why is that? Because we're naming particular experiences, and all of us know what it means to have a particular experience, because that is the nature of a first mind society. Is it talks about particular experiences, sequential experiences, experiences one after the other, right? So this is a laptop, but it's a laptop as contrasted with the space around it, right? The boundaries of the laptop are somewhere here. and the boundaries of this laptop contrast with the space that's around it. And because there's this contrast, we know what the laptop is. The laptop is a particular, right? It's like a particle. It's a distinct unit. Same thing for a hand. It's a distinct unit with reference to the space around it. We don't generally talk about the space, but the only reason we recognize this hand is because we recognize that which is not hand all around it. And that contrast provides the awareness of hand. So because we talk about things like this discretely, we're used to drawing distinct boundaries, and anything with a boundary we can describe very easily. Laptop, hand, finger, body, what else? Bed, chair, on and on and on. But you'll notice whatever we cannot draw a boundary around very distinctly, we have a very hard time describing. Examples, mind. Right? What is the mind? Where is the mind? So many questions about mind. Why? Because it's not something that we have learned to see distinctly and notice distinctly and define distinctly and therefore describe distinctly. Right? Sky is another one. Where exactly is the sky? We know it's up, but where does the sky begin? Where does it end? We have an idea that all of this is sky. Is it the air? Right? Is it the clouds? Is it space? So sky is another one. Soul is another one. And many such, idea. What exactly is an idea? What is a boundary of an idea? Feeling, right? People say if we talk about feelings as opposed to talking about something, some kind of measurements, then feelings are soft, right? There's a saying, feelings are soft. What does it mean that feelings are soft? It means there's no hard boundary to it, right? A feeling is not like a book. A book, you can very clearly see the sharp angles that delineate a book. We cannot see that for a feeling. It blurs out, and so it's soft, right? So the point being that when we ask this question, do we only know what we know relative to other things we know in the first mind? Yes. The book and the hand and the fingers and the body and the bed, all of these have something in common, and that is the boundary condition that is very distinct. And so we can relate anything that has boundaries to each other. Right? We can say a book is like a bed, and that both might be rectangularly shaped. Right? They may be very different in some ways, but they're also very similar in some ways. So all things in the first mind can be related to each other. And there are two follow-up questions to this. Is the second mind and self-realization harder to hold on to because we can't realize self or second mind relative to anything else? Yes. So again, everything that we name and talk about generally is a first mind condition, is a first mind entity, right? Distinct things are first mind superimpositions. But why is it that we are always speaking about the second mind, trying to clarify the second mind, bring this second mind into a vivid experience? Why? Because we can't realize the second mind relative to anything else, right? Because it is defined by the dissolving of the boundary. So if we don't have a boundary, how do we describe something, right? Everything that we say has some kind of boundary. And that's why it becomes difficult to describe mind, right? So yes, the reason it is hard to hold on to is because we can't realize it relative to anything else. Now, one technique that is often talked about, though, is to see this everything else that we talk about. What does this everything else have in common? And that is the boundary condition. Anything and everything we can talk about particularly that we can agree on. Now, we can make up words that could have a lot of meaning for us, but it might not be something that others can recognize. But at least the things that we can agree on in what we perceive or what we're talking about, those are generally all first mind boundary conditions. And if we can recognize that, then we can begin to see that everything that we're talking about and seeing is a first mind phenomenon. And once we do this, this is kind of an access point to the second mind, because we start to recognize that the boundary we see over there as a laptop, the boundary we see over here as a body, the boundary we hear as a sound, the boundary we sense as a feeling, that all of these boundaries originate or are superimposed from one and the same place. And this is an indication of the second mind. Right? So is it harder to hold on to because we can't realize the second mind relative to anything else? Yes. The first mind is in relationship with other first mind phenomena. Someone said, it seems like I'm never going to gain access to our second mind. Maybe thinking about it, and so that's what this chapter is about simplicity. So we'll talk about simplicity a little bit more, right? All of these concepts and ideas that we're talking about are simply to tie in all of the subjects, the understanding that are given as the first mind, right, in the various disciplines and fields of human knowledge, to tie them together and to bring some commonality to them and see through that. It doesn't mean that one has to intellectually understand the second mind or the first mind or the third mind, so don't get caught up in that. But if one is interested in recognizing how all of these tie together and why it is that what we are talking about as consciousness is not contrary to or different from or in contrast with what all of these fields are saying, then this three minds framework is helpful. Ultimately, simplicity by itself, without having to understand intellectual concepts, is also a way, right? There's no need to go through all of these. Rob says, where can I buy the book? This is available on Amazon, Rob, or also on my website on anoopkumar.com. You can click through there and it's available. All right. And one more thing is that we are this second mind and we are this third mind, right? We'll get to this in the conversation about simplicity. So the last question here, the same group of questions, a follow-up. Does this fact we have no knowledge for description of second mind frustrate the first mind? Yes. In fact, this is what somebody said, right? It seems like I'm never going to gain access. So this is what this question addresses exactly. The fact that we have no language for description of the second mind frustrates the first mind, right? Because it exactly gets this feeling of impossibility, or it's difficult, or it's so abstract, or where is it? And the follow-up question is how to prevent this, right? So when we're talking about this boundary condition that defines the first mind, what is it? If we go back, it's probably many months now, to earlier in the series, we talked about the boundary condition in detail. So please go back and look at those. We talked about some of the experiences that comprise this boundary condition, right, of the first mind. These are emotions, these are belief systems, these are events or memories that we have pushed away that still are baked within us. And when all of these bake into us and define who we are, then this is that first mind condition. Now, this doesn't have to be stuff that we label bad. It doesn't have to be stuff that we label traumatic. It is that also, but it's even the stuff that we label very good. This defines me as a very good person. This defines me as a great person or an evil person. Whatever it is that defines us in this way, it is simply seeing through this, processing this and seeing through this. It's not that we have to leave it. It's not that we're saying that we are undefined as individuals. No, we're not leaving our abilities, our talents, our communicating, our interfacing, our working, our feeling, our thinking. We're not leaving these behind. We're simply seeing through and beyond this to the subtler presence that we are, right? So specifically, how to prevent this frustration, which goes back to the earlier comment that it seems like I'm never going to gain access. So frustration by itself, this feeling of frustration, this is part of that boundary condition, right? To take a live example right now, the frustration that we feel is part of this boundary condition. So how does one then see through this boundary condition. It's not by saying I'm not frustrated. It's not by pretending that I'm not frustrated, because then that frustration just bakes in even deeper, right? But it's simply by experiencing this boundary, whatever this boundary is that I don't want to experience, that has become hard, that feels sharp or cutting or jarring or bruising, whatever this is, if I'm able to, experiencing this frustration, right? Allowing it to wash through, right? Because as that frustration is fully experienced, not that I want to push it away, not that I want to leap over it and ignore it, but as that frustration is fully experienced, it dissipates. And as it dissipates, the extent to which that frustration was composing that boundary also dissipates the boundary, right? So if there are if there are 10 major things that happen that we might label positive or we might label negative, that have had significant impacts on us and are having significant impacts on us, either consciously or subconsciously, then experiencing what effects they have is a way of dissipating that. And to that extent, that boundary will be seen through, right? Now, having said this, what thing to pay attention to, one thing to be aware of, is that these are powerful experiences, right? These have to be very powerful experiences. Otherwise, there would not be so much interest in what we call spirituality, or what is called enlightenment, or what is called awareness, right? The reason that there is so much interest in this is because there's some kind of veil somewhere, right? It's not that people don't know or people are unintelligent. No, there's some kind of veil, there's some kind of block somewhere that is diminishing this kind of vision, or diminishing this. So these have to be powerful experiences that are baked into this sense of boundary, right? So as we experience this, we have to make sure that we have the right kind of support. That's really key, right? Because sometimes this can be extremely overwhelming. And if it's too overwhelming, then we can't function in our lives. Remember, what we're talking about is the second mind is a equilibrium or a homeostasis of mind, of identity, in which we can function through the individuality, function through all of our abilities and talents and expressions, and enjoy that experience, right? Relish that experience fully. Sometimes pleasurable, sometimes painful, but in some way experience that fully, while also recognizing the subtler nature that we are, right? So in that process of moving through this boundary, of seeing through this boundary, if the experiences are too intense, which they can be, they will almost assuredly be intense, because if they were not intense, then there would be no questions, right? Everything will be clear. So the fact that there are suggests that there is intensity there, right? So make sure that the right kind of support is there, either from friends or from family. Many people might not understand it. Many people might not want to go through this process. So make sure there's support from people that you trust. You know, you can use journaling, you can use exercise, moving the body. The body is the mind is the body. So moving the body in certain ways can help to release that boundary of the mind as well, right? Taking walks in nature, being in nature especially, can be helpful. So take whatever steps are necessary. So on one hand, you need to create an environment, right, that allows this kind of process to happen, and then also moving through that process. If it's just one or the other, it can become very difficult. So keep attention on this as well, creating the kind of environment that allows this to unfold safely, and that you have people around you that you can trust, you have processes in place, and then move through this. All right. So Ralph says the block is no empirical evidence. This is a belief system, not science. Correct. So What we're talking about as the block, I'm simply talking about block as a boundary. All right. It is not that the boundary is not necessary. Again, the boundary is necessary to function through, but this is, if it is experienced, then that boundary is made up of these thoughts, belief systems, emotions, etc. Right? For it to be a matter of science, we would need everybody to, or at least a certain amount of people, to recognize this the same way, to label this the same way, and to go through this process, right? And that is not going to happen at this time because everybody is using different words for this. Everyone has different terms for this. Everyone has a different experience of this, right? This is what has been, same thing that's been talked about for millennia. I'm using specific descriptions and specific terms. So no, this is not in the realm of science. This is according to which science develops, right? When we talk about science now, we're talking about first mind concepts, right? Because we have to delineate things with a boundary first before we can name them and before we can study them. But what I'm suggesting is looking into that which allows the boundaries to appear, that from which boundaries derive. And for this, this has to be a process of experimentation. I also do not advise for it to become a belief system. So that's a good point, Ralph, that you made, that this should not be something that somebody believes. Somebody said something, somebody wrote something, so I believe that it's true. It's not really helpful for anyone, right? Okay, somebody said something. It sounds interesting. Let me experiment and see if it's helpful. Let me experiment to see if it unfolds as described. If so, that is its own evidence, right? And that stands by itself. All right. So now we are on chapter 9. Our nature is simplicity itself. So I'll read a few lines here. It says, I invite you to try this exercise for a moment. Close the eyes, relax, and see if you notice the still, silent center within you. So let's do this for a brief moment. Close the eyes, relax, and see if you notice silence. Let's leave aside within you or without you. See if you can feel this silence. This ease. All right. I'll go back and read a few more lines. Notice that the stillness always remains even as activity continues. So we experience some level of silence, and now there's the sound, right? And now if the eyes open, there are perceptions. There are visual perceptions moving around, colors, forms. So there's sound, there's form. And see if you can notice, even with this, that there is a silence, right? There's a silence in which there is vision and there is sound. There's a silence, the tail end of which modifies itself as vision and sound. All right. So this stillness is the gateway to a part of ourselves that our minds obscure, right? And here, mind was referring to the first mind. The stillness is the gateway to a part of ourselves that our minds obscure. The gate is plain. There are no fancy markings. It is so simple that it is often missed. Right? So Again, the first mind's tendency to focus exclusively on demarcated experiences means that anything that is not demarcated is missed because it doesn't qualify as something, right? So this is just making a note of simplicity. The stillness is a gateway. The gate is plain. There are no fancy markings. And it's so simple that it's often missed. As one approaches the gate, a band might play, fireworks may go off, movies might run. All of these may come, and therefore all of these will go. So this is suggesting that the stillness is quite plain. There's no fancy window dressing, right? It doesn't have to be electric. And it's also true that in the stillness, just as in the stillness now, sound happens and vision happens and so many things happen and emotions happen, thoughts happen, just like this happens. Similarly, in this stillness, in this silence, a band might play, fireworks may go off, right? It may feel electric. It may feel revolutionary. Many things may happen, right? And this is what people sometimes refer to as that is enlightenment. This is enlightenment, right? Things that happen. And it's up to any one person to choose how they wish to think of it. That's a different matter. There is this simplicity and this silence that is always here. And it's important to recognize this in and of itself, aside from everything else that we're talking about, or as an aspect of everything else that we're talking about. Because otherwise, understanding the three minds, as it were, by itself is not possible, right? Understanding it in and of itself as a framework is not possible. Because the more of it, the more that mind starts to shift, the more the framework itself makes sense, right? So cultivating this silence, right? These are all synonymous. Stillness, silence, openness, availability, all of these are synonyms in this context. All right, so cultivating this openness that is independent or that is always present, irrespective of all the content that appears. This is key to recognizing and understanding the three minds. Because the three minds itself is an intellectual concept only so far. So let's spend a few minutes in this openness. right? Thank you, and I will see you next Tuesday at 2 p.m. as we continue with this book.